Hello, tributes, and welcome to the fourth episode of Tales of Xebec. This episode will be going over the files of the 31st through 40th Hunger Games. I'd again like to thank Christian Blanco and Lauren, who wrote Tales of the Hunger Games and Panem Reborn, respectively. As always, good luck, and may the odds be ever in your favor. The 31st Hunger Games took place in the Impossible Garden Maze. The weather was sunny skies, the games lasted for 3 days, and there were no notable months. After several years without a career victory, the more competitive districts were beginning to lose hope of achieving another victory anytime soon. Fortunately, the victor this year knew that they had to put on a good show, and did not hold back in order to claim their victory. This year's victor was 20-year-old Camille Durand from District 1. As the tributes rose into the arena this year, they were each confused to see none of their allies or foes surrounding them, and instead were all met with separate entrances to a large garden maze, and completely alone. The cornucopia that year was about 3 miles in, right at the center of the maze. Realizing there was no place to go but in, Camille rushed into the maze, though soon became frustrated by all the dead ends and loops she was met with, so much so that she ended up kicking a hedge, which ended up shouting in pain as her ally, Elias from 2, painfully clutched his leg as he crumbled to the floor. The two flung themselves into a heated argument, with Elias scratching his bare arms furiously, arguing that he was searching through tributes in the bushes when the girl had sprung up and randomly attacked him. Camille, already frustrated by the confusing arena, took her anger out on the boy, throwing strong punches at his face, which saw him fall unconscious. Camille took the opportunity to bash his head into the dirt, and after claiming her first kill, she inspected the hedges that surrounded her. The leaves that made up the towering bushes were penetrable, but it looked like they were made of some pretty strong poison ivy. Upon realizing this, Camille turned back to the body of Elias before a hovercraft could take him away. She removed his clothes, tore his shirt in two, and wrapped each half around her hands. After this, she took the rest of the boy's clothes and wrapped them around all of the exposed skin she was showing. After completing this action, Camille carefully rushed through the hedges and moved directly inwards towards the cornucopia. With no skin exposed, Camille wasn't affected by the poison ivy, and again, she got to the center, and once she got to the center of the arena, she was met with a clear cornucopia, flooded with hedge cutters, food, and other materials. The only other tributes that had made it to the cornucopia before Camille were Stephanie and Gustav, who were both too busy itching themselves to notice Camille's arrival. This allowed the girl from District 1 to grab a pair of hedge cutters and easily pick them off. After securing a weapon and some food, Camille hid most of the supplies, and still with her clothed armor, moved through inner part of the arena, picking off itchy tributes and making sure none of her competition were able to pick up weapons to defend themselves with. This allowed Camille to easily pick off most of the tributes, and sealed her victory, though it took her 3 days to find all the remaining tributes, many of whom either painfully hid themselves in the IV, or, in the case of the final tribute, had remained on the outskirts of the maze, though due to lack of food or water, Camille was easily able to decapitate them with her hedge cutters. After her victory, Camille was welcomed back to District 1 as a hero, and went on to teach in the training academies in her hometown. She was known as a strict and scary instructor, though she did not go on to train though she did go on to train a successful victor, unlike some mentors. Camille took on a husband later down the line and had 4 kids, all of whom participated in the volunteer ceremonies for their district. The 32nd Hunger Games took place in Bodrum, Turkey. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for 3 days, and the notable nuts were friendly dolphins. After last year's games produced a much-beloved victor, the capital was happy, but like always, they wanted more. Well, if more career victors is what they wanted, more career victors is what they were about to get. This year's victor was 17-year-old Thomas Janssens from District 0. When the tributes rose into the arena, Thomas recognized this place as a place he visited within District 17. Immediately, Thomas lost hope in victory. He had remembered the past victors winning in their home field because of a home field advantage, and here Thomas was, without the home field advantage. When the gong sounded, Thomas ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword. To his surprise, the tributes from District 17 were targeted and killed first, which raised his hope of victory. Thomas then ran at Gianna from -1 with his sword. Thomas then swung his sword at her, but she easily ducked under it and hit Thomas in the arm with her sword. Thomas then swung his sword at Gianna's head, and it hit this time, sounding Gianna's cannon. Thomas then ran into the city. Thomas then ran to a dock with a few boats docked at it. Thomas inspected the boats and saw no tributes on any of them, but that wouldn't last long. A few minutes after Thomas found the area, an announcement was made that every tribute had to find their way to the boats or else they would be killed. Since Thomas was right there, he easily made his way onto a sailboat and started to get it ready to sail away from the mainland. As Thomas was preparing his boat for sailing, Sophia from 21 approached. Instead of the two attacking each other, however, they looked at each other in contemplation. After a few seconds, Thomas let Sophia onto his boat. He decided that he would sail the boat and Sophia would man the weapons. When the boat was ready, Thomas took off right as the couriers were approaching. The couriers then got the other boat ready and took off after Sophia and Thomas. As Thomas and Sophia were sailing away from the couriers, one of 2 outer district tribute alliances sailed towards the couriers and got into a big fight with them, giving Thomas and Sophia enough time to escape. A few hours later, Sophia informed Thomas that she would be going to bed. Thomas stayed on deck to captain the ship. Thomas eventually went into the ship to sleep as well. What Thomas didn't realize was that someone was hiding in the corner of the room. In the morning, Thomas woke up to see Sophia's dead body laying in her bed, her throat ripped open with a hook sticking out of it. Thomas then flipped on the lights and saw something written in Sophia's blood. "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?" Thomas wasn't sure why the killer Sophia kept him alive, but he wasn't complaining. Thomas went back up to the top deck to see a trail of blood that led off of the deck and into the water. Thomas slowly walked to the edge of the deck and looked over the edge to see a lot of blood on the bottom of the bow and a bunch of hungry sharks beneath him. After this, Thomas wired up the weapons so he could fire them from behind the wheel. Thomas then got behind the wheel and started to hunt for other tributes. Later that night, Thomas ran into the final tribute, Kelsey from 0. He followed her until the morning, when he finally struck. Thomas turned the boat so the weapons were pointed at Kelsey's boat. Kelsey didn't see Thomas's boat, however, so she continued to sail. Thomas then shot his weapons at the hull of Kelsey's ship. This started to sink Kelsey's ship. Kelsey had to make a choice, either jump into the shark-infested water and die that way, or stay on her ship and sink with it, ultimately dying the same way. Kelsey decided to stay on the ship and go down with it. Thomas then proceeded to watch Kelsey's ship with her on it. The sharks then proceeded to eat Kelsey alive. Kelsey's screams could be heard all across Xebec. After the games, Thomas returned home to District 0, where he was celebrated for bringing victory to his district. Thomas opened up the Thomas Jansen's Training Academy 5 years after his victory. Thomas then proceeded to marry his girlfriend at the time of the games. He lived a happy life with her and their 20 kids until he died of a stroke at the age of 89. The 33rd Hunger Games took place in Comerica Park, Detroit. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for 1 day, and there were no notable mutts. After last year's games produced a victor without the home field advantage, the capital wanted something different. The capital of Xebec ended up bringing in some of the game makers from Pan Am to give them an idea for something different in the arenas. Eventually, they agreed on a landmark in Detroit known as Comerica Park. The victor this year was 23-year-old Andrew Garcia from District A0D. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Andrew immediately recognized this place as the baseball field he would play baseball in with his dad and android assistant. When the gong sounded, Andrew ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword. He immediately ran over the rest of the careers and they started to go around the arena. As the careers roamed around the arena, Alara from 17 fell back in the pack to talk to Andrew. The two had formed a strong bond and with each other during training. Alara brought up the fact that Andrew hadn't taken his eyes off of her and Katie from 15 once since they started hunting, to which Andrew commented on the fact that he was looking at the only pieces of eye candy in this arena. When Andrew said this, Alara blushed slightly, and Katie also fell back to the back of the pack to see what Andrew and Alara were talking about. The trio then continued to talk for the rest of the day until a pack of outer district tributes attacked the career pack. This pack of outliers actually managed to mow down a large number of the career pack, leaving only Andrew, Alara, and Katie from the careers. The outlier attacked the 3 remaining careers, but eventually the 3 careers overpowered them. Realizing that the number of tributes in the arena was dwindling, Andrew realized what he had to do. He took out his sword, and as the girls turned away from him, he easily ran at them and slit their throats from behind. After this, it was only Andrew and Isla from -1 left in the arena. Andrew and Isla met up at the cornucopia and took out their weapons, preparing for the other person to make the first move. After a few minutes, Isla made the first move. She ran at Andrew and with hatred in her heart and the fire of 1,000 suns in her mind. Her mind was racing a mile a minute and there was no stopping her, or at least she thought so. As Isla got closer to Andrew, all he had to do was stretch his foot out into her path and she easily tripped over it. Andrew then stood over her with fire and passion in his eyes. He then plunged his sword into her neck and let her die a slow and painful death. After his victory, Andrew returned home where he was celebrated for bringing victory to District A0D. After his victory, Andrew returned home where he was celebrated for bringing District A0D its 3rd victory and 2nd male victor. Andrew went on to marry an android within the district known as Olivia. Andrew and Olivia adopted 10 kids together, 5 boys and 5 girls. Their eldest daughter would be reaped in the year of the 36th Hunger Games. Their eldest daughter, whose name was Olive, would then go on to participate in the 40th Hunger Games at the age of 10. The 34th Hunger Games took place in Heaven's Fall. The weather was beautiful clear skies. The games lasted for 5 hours and there were no notable months. After last year's games produced a much beloved victor and yet another career victor, the capital wanted more career victors. Luckily for them, if it's a career victor they wanted, it was a career victor they were about to get. This year's victor was 15-year-old Aline Abakelia from District 23. When the tributes were raised into the arena, Aline was immediately in awe over the beautiful surroundings that surrounded her. When the gong sounded, Aline ran into the cornucopia with the rest of the careers. In the cornucopia, Aline grabbed a sword and then went on to kill 7 tributes, including Rory from 11, Talia from 9, and Julio from 22, just to name a few. Meanwhile, the rest of the careers killed 10 tributes altogether. After the bloodbath, Aline ran into her boyfriend James's arms, and they embraced before kissing each other. Aline then smiled at James as they started to hunt with the rest of the careers. Aline and the careers hunted for a while until a group of outliers, who referred to themselves as anti-careers, jumped out from the bushes. The anti-careers actually managed to kill off most of the careers, leaving only Leonardo from 4, Aline from 23, and James from 23. The 3 careers then split up. Leonardo and James stayed back to kill off the rest of the anti-careers, while Aline ran off. After a few hours, the president's voice came through the intercoms saying that Aline had made it to the top 5. After this announcement, Aline jumped behind a bush nearby to the waterfalls. Soon, Isla from -1, Leonardo from 4, Nina from 15, and Jack from 16 came into the cornucopia. When they arrived, they didn't realize that Aline was still alive. The 4 tributes fought each other until Nina from 15 came out on top. Aline then jumped out of the bush and grabbed Nina in a chokehold before throwing her off the edge of the cliff. After her victory, Aline returned home where she was celebrated for bringing victory to her district. She stayed in her district and opened the Aline Abakelia Training Academy, where she would train future tributes how to be sneaky and how to perform surprise attacks. The 35th Hunger Games took place in the Mediterranean Sea. The weather was rainy, the games lasted for 6 hours, and the notable months were hungry sharks. After last year's games produced a not-so-favored victor among capitalites, it was time for the reapings of the 35th Hunger Games. This year's victor was 17-year-old Owen Evans from District 24. When the tributes rose into the arena, the tributes realized that the cornucopia was on the island of Sicily. When the gong sounded, Owen ran into the cornucopia. Owen grabbed a bow, a quiver of arrows, and a vial of poison. He then ran off and dived into the water. Owen then swam over to the island of Malta. He hid inside of a nearby building and tried to cool off. Owen then stayed inside the building for a few minutes until he heard another tribute arrive on the island. He looked out of the doorway and saw his ally Evie from -1. Owen ran out of the building and hugged the tiny girl. Evie may have been tiny, but she was feisty. Evie immediately raised her voice at Owen, asking him why he left her alone in the cornucopia as she fought the careers. Owen apologized multiple times until Evie finally forgave him. Evie then kissed Owen on the cheek and smiled innocently. It was later revealed that Evie has dissociative identity disorder. One moment she could be pissed off and yelling your ear off, and the next she could be the sweetest little thing. Owen cautiously pushed her away. Owen then said that they shouldn't do that, or else they might get too attached to each other. Owen and Evie then roamed around the arena and just talked. Evie talked about how beautiful the place was. and that if they weren't in the Hunger Games, Evie would love to live here with Owen. Eventually, Evie stopped Owen. She then went on to say that her and Owen should do the things that Owen was scared to do. She eventually managed to get out that seeing as they were gonna die soon, they should live their lives to the fullest. Evie then kissed Owen and they started to get intimate. When they were done, Owen held Evie's tiny body in his hands. After a little while, Owen and Evie heard a stick crack behind them. The pair turned around to see Cicely from 4. Cicely had just turned on the career pack and killed every single one of them. Owen and Evie prepared to fight. Owen and Evie managed to hold their own pretty well until Cicely dealt a fatal blow to Evie's chest. Owen then fought back by dealing a fatal blow to Cicely's head. Evie and Cicely's cannons both sounded at the same time. After Evie's death, Owen was furious. Owen then decided to leave him and Evie's camp and hunt for the final few tributes. Owen explored the arena for hours upon hours and eliminated any tributes that he saw along the way until it was just him and Louise from 1. Owen hunted for Louise until he finally found her cuddling up next to a heater. Owen then proceeded to slam Louise's head into the heater multiple times until her cannon sounded. After the games, Owen returned home where he would be called the Black Knight. Owen would stay in District 24 and mentor future tributes. Owen wouldn't mentor a successful victor until 25 years after his victory. The 36th Hunger Games took place in mini Europe. The weather was rainy, the games lasted for 1 week, and the notable mutts were grizzly bears and pigs. After last year's games, the Capitol thought the arena was pretty interesting, and so they put together a slightly bigger arena with a similar theme to last year's. This year's victor was 14-year-old Maximilian Albert from District X. When the tributes rose into the arena, Maximilian noticed that him and the other tributes rose up somewhere in Denmark. When the gong sounded, a lot of tributes ran away from the cornucopia, Max being one of them. While most tributes ran south into Germany, Maximilian ran north and swam across the North Sea and climbed onto the southern shore of Norway. Maximilian climbed up onto the shore and looked across the water to the bloodbath occurring in Germany. One of the people killed in the bloodbath was Maximilian's girlfriend and district partner Maria. Maximilian watched as 41 tributes got killed in the bloodbath, leaving only 17 tributes in the arena. Maximilian then ran over to Finland, getting as far away from the bloodbath as possible. Just then, he ran into Aphrodite from 9. They both prepared to fight each other. To the surprise of both tributes in the capital, the two tributes didn't fight. Instead, they formed a temporary truce. Aphrodite and Maximilian then went off to get supplies for their camp. Aphrodite went and got the tent she had just about managed to snag from the cornucopia, while Maximilian went to go get some food. When Maximilian returned to his camp with Aphrodite, he saw her setting up a fire to cook whatever Maximilian had caught. Maximilian smiled at this and sat next to her and watched her work. When Aphrodite finished setting up the fire, she smiled at Maximilian and moved out of his way so he could cook. Maximilian had caught a pig in the Estonian section of the arena. When Maximilian finished cooking, he cut the cooked pig meat in half and gave half of it to Aphrodite. The two then ate and talked throughout the rest of the night until they fell asleep. A few days later, there were only 5 tributes left. Aphrodite had died in an ambush perpetrated by the careers on the 3rd day. The top 5 were Maximilian from District X, Mia from District A0D, Luis from 1, Lucia from 2, 22, and Jack from 23. Maximilian started wandering closer to the cornucopia from his camp in Finland, when suddenly a massive snowstorm came. Maximilian knew that this was an arena event to force him closer to the cornucopia, and so he ran over to Sweden and down to the southern tip and dived into the water. When Maximilian arrived in the Denmark sector of the arena, he ran into Mia and Luis. Maximilian took out his sword while Mia and Luis took out their spears. Maximilian, Mia, and Luis fought long and hard until Maximilian came out on top. Maximilian then continued his journey to the cornucopia. When Maximilian arrived at the cornucopia, he saw Lucia and Jack fighting. When Lucia came out on top, she turned around and looked up at Maximilian. Lucia then screamed and tried to run, but it was too late. With one swift movement, Maximilian decapitated Lucia, making Maximilian the victor of the 36th Hunger Games. After the games, Maximilian returned to District X, where he would form the Albert Training Academy, which would later become the most well-known training academy in the district. Eventually, Maximilian would marry Juliette Sabon. Juliette and Maximilian would then go on to have a record 34 kids together, 12 sons and 22 daughters. One of Maximilian's daughters would then go on to marry into the Bolahan family and have a daughter who she would name Alexandra, who would go on to become the victor of the 118th Hunger Games. Maximilian's 34 children would go on to produce a total of 408 grandkids for Maximilian and Juliette, making the Albert family the largest family in all of Xebec. The 37th Hunger Games took place in Istanbul, Turkey. The weather was sunny, the games lasted for 1 week, and the notable months were Hungry Seagulls. After last year's games, the victor became one of the most popular victors in all of Xebec, before being beaten in popularity by his own granddaughter multiple years later. Maximilian also became the first ever victor to perform the reapings the games after, and he would be the start of this trend. This year's victor was 16-year-old Jack Smith from District -1. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Jack didn't recognize the place. He saw the flags of Turkey from the old world, and so he correctly assumed that the capital was trying to rig the games for another District 17 victory. When the gong sounded, Jack immediately ran away from the cornucopia with his allies Millie from -1, Amara from 22, and Antonio from 20, unknowingly ran into the cornucopia, not having realized what Jack had realized. When Jack arrived at a place he figured was relatively safe, he looked around at his surroundings. Jack saw the amazing buildings surrounding him and the river flowing to his left. Jack would then go on to test out the water in the river. He eventually realized the water was safe to drink. He decided that this water source would be his and his alone. Now all Jack needed to do was find some food. Jack would look around until he saw a bag of meat that a tribute had before their death. Jack would grab this bag of meat and run back to his camp, grabbing a knife along the way. Jack would sigh and end up going to sleep. Jack would then wake up at only midnight when the fallen tributes were shown in the sky. Unsurprisingly, Jack had seen the portraits of Millie and Antonio, but to his surprise, he didn't see the portrait of Amara, meaning she was still alive. Jack immediately started to look around for Amara. As he looked for his friend, he heard the cannons of tributes dying, and he was scared that every one of those cannons could be hers. Eventually, Jack came across Juliet from one and Amara fighting each other. It turned out that the cannons Jack was hearing was Amara killing off a lot of the careers, and Juliet was the last of them. Jack ran into the fight and helped Amara defeat Juliet. When the fight was done, Amara sighed at Jack before telling him off for leaving him and the others alone in the cornucopia to die. Jack just sighed and took this punishment because he did deserve it. When Amara was done telling off Jack, the pair agreed to return to Jack's camp. After Amara's huge fight with the careers, there were only 7 tributes left, although these 7 remaining tributes were spread about the arena very well. Jack and Amara spent 4 days getting to know each other. They even discussed a plan for survival. Jack had mentioned that a friend of his from District 3 had made a faulty tracker for any tribute who was lucky enough to receive it that would tell the game makers that a tribute was dead, even if they weren't. After mentioning this, Jack then told Amara that she was the tribute that received the faulty tracker. This gave Jack and Amara an idea. Before they carried out this plan, Amara told Jack about a hidden stash of food she had near the cornucopia. Jack smiled and thanked Amara before grabbing a weapon. Amara then smiled and said that she'd see him later before Jack swung his sword at Amara. He inflicted a wound that knocked her unconscious instead of killing her, but her tracker had stated that she was dead, and so her cannon sounded. Jack then smiled as the hovercraft took Amara away, and he muttered that he would see her again when he got home. Jack then went to find Amara's secret food stash. Eventually, he found it and made the mistake of taking the food out in the open. Just then, he hears the sound of seagulls above him. Jack looked up to see the seagulls swooping down at him. He dodged the seagulls, but his food was not so lucky. The seagulls stole a majority of Jack's food from him, taking it up into the air and doing whatever they could to stop Jack from getting it back. When Jack got back to his camp, he only had about 30% of the food Amara had left for him. He frowned at this very small amount of food he had left, and after the seagulls had stolen it from him. A few days later, Jack was already running low on food. He did know something in his favor, though. There was only one other tribute left. Just then, the river that had been his water source since the beginning started to rise. Jack knew this had to be an arena event and ran to the cornucopia where Ivan from 18 was waiting for him. The ensuing fight took a few hours in order to complete, but eventually Jack came out on top and stabbed Ivan in the gut. Ivan then went through a slow and agonizing death before his cannon sounded, making Jack the victor of this year's games. After the games, Jack returned home to District -1, where he was given the news that Amara had survived her wounds. Meanwhile, in District 22, Amara returned home where she was hailed a hero and was given the title the Unkillable Amara. After their 18th birthdays, Amara and Jack got married and had 5 kids together, 2 boys and 3 girls, none of which would compete in the games. The 38th Hunger Games took place in an arena known as the Northern Lights. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for 2 days, and the notable mutts were hungry wolves. After the very hated victor and survivor of last year's games, the Capitol assassinated Jack's friend from District 3 before this year's games were set to take place. This year, the Capitol wanted a more interesting games where there was actually only one victor. This year's victor was 21-year-old Noah Jensen from the Capitol. When the tributes were raised into the arena, Noah looked around and at the beautiful rolling hills of this year's arena. He then looked up to see the northern lights. He was taken aback by the beauty of this arena and almost just stood there on his podium looking at it. When the gong sounded, Noah was snapped out of his trance by the sound and ran into the cornucopia. He then grabbed a sword before setting a new record for kills in the games, killing 40 tributes right away, including his supposed ally and district partner. This left only 14 tributes remaining. Noah would then spend the rest of the first day roaming the arena and trying to find a steady source of food and water. Noah would then explore the arena and kill a further 7 tributes. By nightfall, it was just Noah and Emily from 7 left. Noah and Emily would journey to the cornucopia and meet up with each other there. Noah noticed that the little girl was unarmed, which made him ask how she survived this long to himself. In order to make it a fair fight, Noah gave Emily an extra sword he had acquired a while back. The two then started to fight. Although Noah had given Emily his extra sword to make it a fair fight, he was still a lot stronger than the small little girl. Emily was pretty good at dodging Noah's attacks, though. Eventually, the pair heard the howls of approaching mutts. Emily didn't want to die a slow death being eaten by the mutts, but Noah wouldn't kill her. Just then, the mutts bursted through the tree line and ran at the pair of tributes. Noah ran on top of the cornucopia, only to have his leg bitten by a wolf. The wolf then pulled Noah off the cornucopia and began to eat him. Luckily for him, Emily died to the mutts before the wolf could finish, making Noah the victor. After the games, Noah returned home to the Capitol, where he was celebrated for bringing an interesting victory to the games. Although his injuries sustained from the wolf attack were almost fatal, he survived and went on to get himself a boyfriend. Eventually, Noah married his boyfriend Elias and adopted 2 kids with him, 1 boy and 1 girl. He would also become a Capitol favorite. Not the most favorite, but one of the most favorites. The 39th Hunger Games took place on the Faroe Islands. The weather was stormy, the games lasted for 2 days, and the notable mutts were hungry sharks. Again. After last year's games greatly impressed the Capitol, the districts had a lot to aspire to. This year was the 13th triennial quell, and the quell twist was that siblings of the previous tributes would be reaped. The victor this year was the brother of the previous year's victor. This year's victor was 22-year-old Emil Jensen from the Capitol. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Emil immediately recognized this place as the Faroe Islands. Him and his family would regularly visit these islands on vacation. They did this so much, in fact, that they bought a house on the island as a second home of sorts. Emil smiled as when he realized this, as he now knew he had the home field advantage. Emil would look around at the beautiful sights that he had seen so many times before and smile more. When the gong sounded, Emil ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a mace before immediately swinging it at Charlotte from -1, killing her in an instant, making her the first death of this year's games. Emil would then go on to kill 20 more tributes, including a lot of the Career Alliance, before running away from the cornucopia. Emil didn't go inland, but instead went to the shore and sat in a cave, hidden by crashing waves. He heard people approach his cave before subsequently hearing their cannon sound. After they had been crushed by a crashing wave and taken out to the ocean, where the terrifying currents ripped them apart. 10 more tributes would die in this fashion overnight. The next day, it was already down to the top 10. Emil decided to leave his cave and hunt for the remaining 9 tributes, other than himself. After getting to a safe height from the sea, he noticed sharks swimming around in it. Emil would eventually decide to use these hungry sharks to his advantage. Whenever Emil would find a tribute, he'd stab them through the gut before throwing them off the nearest cliff and into the sea, where if the sharks didn't eat them, the currents took care of them pretty quick. Eventually, it was just down to Emil and Maja from the capital. Emil and Maja met up at the cornucopia, one covered in blood, the other covered in sweat. It was clear that to Emil that Maja had been running a lot more than killing, and so he thought this fight would be an easy victory. To Emil's surprise, though, his district partner held her own amazingly. There were even a few points in time where Emil thought he'd lose, until he was finally able to deal a fatal blow to Maja's neck, and her cannon sounded, making Emil the victor. After the games, Emil returned to the capital, where he was deemed the Shark Killer. At first, Emil didn't like this nickname, thinking it made him seem like he had killed sharks, until someone finally explained to him that they had meant that he used the sharks to kill other tributes, hence the nickname. Eventually, Emil would go on to marry his best friend at the time of his victory, Freya. Him and Freya would go on to have 19 kids, 2 sons and 17 daughters. One of his sons and all 17 of his daughters would go on to volunteer for the games, but only one would come out alive. Out of all of his kids who volunteered, his youngest daughter, Caroline and his eldest son, Lucas, both went on to marry into even richer families than Emil's and have many kids, adding up to 100 grandkids for Emil and Freya. The 40th Hunger Games took place in the Irish castle. The weather was cloudy with slight rain, the games lasted for 4 days, and the notable mutts were cuddly sheeps. After last year's games, the Capitalites would grow a love of castles, and thus this year's arena would be their first castle-based arena. This year's victor was 17-year-old Ronan Walsh from District 11. When the tributes rose into the arena, Ronan noticed the castle grounds sprawling out in front of him. He had been to this castle before. It was right on the outskirts of his home district, in fact. When the gong sounded, Ronan immediately ran into the cornucopia, where he would grab a sword and some food and water before darting to the castle with his district partner Orla. This pair then proceeded to look through the castle for a safe spot to lay their heads. When Orla and Ronan both finally found a safe place, they talked about how they had both been to this castle before and how well the capital had recreated it. When nightfall arrived, Orla and Ronan cuddled together for warmth. That night, the portraits of 7 tributes were shown in the sky. That's when Ronan and Orla knew they were in for a long, painful ride. The next day, the pair were woken up by a nearby footstep. This was revealed to be Mary from -1, who was invited into the career pack to kill the tributes from 11. Orla and Ronan both got up and grabbed their weapons. When Mary came out of the shadows to attack, she swung her knife skillfully at Orla, slicing her neck clean open, sounding her cannon. When Ronan saw this, he was pissed off. He swung his sword at Mary, but the little 12-year-old was quick to dodge the attack. Mary then swung her knife at Ronan, but he too easily dodged the little girl's attack. Eventually, Ronan got the upper hand over Mary. However, Ronan got on top of the little girl with his sword to her throat. He asked the girl if she had any last words, to which Mary replied, "Fuck you," before Ronan sliced Mary's throat open like she had done to Orla. The next few days were uneventful, until the 4th day. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the president came onto the intercoms and congratulated the tributes in the top 5 for making it this far. Ronan had only just realized how many people had died since the games began. It was at this time that Ronan finally felt something he hadn't felt since Orla died: hope. Ronan ran to the cornucopia before the game makers could even send out an event to send the tributes there. Ronan was, of course, the first to arrive at the cornucopia. When Laurent from 1 came out into the cornucopia, 3 cannons sounded simultaneously. This meant that Ronan and Laurent were officially the final 2. Although Laurent was a 28-year-old career tribute, Ronan managed to hold his own extremely well. There were a few moments that were scary for Ronan, but where he thought he'd die. After a few minutes of back-and-forth combat, Ronan finally dealt the fatal blow needed to win the games in Laurent's skull. This, in turn, made Ronan this year's victor. After the games, Ronan returned home, where he was hailed as a hero for bringing District 11 its first victory. Eventually, he'd move to District 1, where he'd meet the love of his life, Andre DuPont. Ronan and Andre proceeded to get married on the 15th anniversary of Ronan's victory, and the two would go on to open an orphanage within District 1, which would end up housing 50 kids at its peak and 20 kids at its lowest. So yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, this episode of Tales of Xebec. After this slide, I will be showing you all information slides on the victors mentioned in this video. Anyways, next episode, I'll be reading the files of the 41st through 50th Hunger Games. Bye, everyone.